quickly going to chart out the agenda for the next 2 days of the conference, where esteemed speakers over a 90-minute session are going to explore the need to prioritize solutions and demonstrable actions for disaster-resilient infrastructure. For this, I would like to invite our Director General, Mr. Amit Prothi, to lead us through the session. Mr. Prothi is an international expert with nearly 25 years of professional leadership in urban planning and resilient infrastructure, and he's experience across 15 countries in the world. So without much ado, I will invite Mr. Amit Prothi.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome to New Delhi. I have to say this is a humbling moment. We've just had the Prime Ministers of India and Bangladesh highlight why the agenda of resilient infrastructure is incredibly important. I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing some global leaders, thought leaders, practitioners, people working in government, trying to move the needle on resilient infrastructure. I'm also excited to see the participation we've received from across the world. We have people registered from Mongolia, we've got people registered from Zambia, we've got people registered from Chile, we've got people registered from Samoa. It's truly a moment where I'm experiencing the global reach of the coalition, and I think that's really humbling for me. The agenda we are talking about is not simple. I think we can't pretend all of us to be sitting here and saying we know the answers. But what excites me and inspires me today is we have incredibly well-renowned structural engineers in the room who've dealt with earthquakes for more than 3-4 decades of their lives. We've got youth leaders working on addressing issues in their community. We've got artists, we've got a variety of perspectives. And why is that important? Because this is not an agenda just for an engineer or a social scientist. It's also an agenda for the academician, the child. It's essentially everybody's agenda because infrastructure touches all of us. We've got a really powerful session now. I'm honored to be moderating this session. I'll share with you who's participating and invite there's Dr. P.K. Mishra, the Prime Minister's Principal Secretary, who's been leading this agenda of disaster-resilient infrastructure for a long time. He has hands-on experience of post-disaster reconstruction in Gujarat. I had the opportunity to hear him last week at the DRR working group at G20, and I could just see how his emotions are tied to this agenda. We'll be hearing from him in a minute. We have Ms. Mami Mizutori, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of UNDRR. I think all of you don't need an introduction to UNDRR and probably don't need an introduction to her as well. She has been an amazing supporter for CDRI from, I won't even say day one, from day -1. So thank you for joining us. And I would like to invite Mami to the stage. So we have Mr. Mark Harbers, Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management from the Government of Netherlands. Netherlands has been a very strong supporter of the coalition, and I had the pleasure of meeting the minister at COP27 when we agreed that Netherlands will bring some of their leading water management practices to support CDRI's water program. So really looking forward to that collaboration. And we had a chance to also sit down yesterday where he was starting to articulate the need for thinking about water differently from a value perspective. I think he brings a lot to for discussion. Minister, please join us. And we have Dr. Raditya Jati from Indonesia. Dr. Jati is the Deputy Minister for Systems and Strategy at the National Disaster Management Authority in Indonesia. Again, he's a very, very well-respected, well-renowned person in the field of disaster management, and he'll be joining us virtually as well. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Mishra to give us his opening remarks.
Thank you. Excellencies, Honorable Minister Mr. Harbers, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General Ms. Mami Mijutori, Honorable Deputy Minister Dr. Jatti, representative from coalition members, and honorable delegates from across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be here with you at the fifth edition of the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Over the last 5 years, in international conference on disaster resilient infrastructure and other similar forums have sustained and amplified the conversation on disaster resilient infrastructure. It is no longer a niche subject. It has come to the center stage of the global and national development discourse. Over the past few years, we have developed a better appreciation. The modern infrastructure systems are interconnected. We need to rapidly provide infrastructure services to millions who have never had access to these services while also ensuring resilience of the system. This has to be achieved in the midst of rapidly changing social, economic, and natural systems. When I say infrastructure to millions, I mean electricity, telecom, hospital services, and so on. The natural progression of this discourse would be to go beyond describing problem to finding solutions. I would like to congratulate CDRI for focusing this edition of their annual conference on search for solutions. I would like to reiterate that what we should to focus is search for solution, not merely stating the problem or preparing an analytical framework. Let me highlight 5 themes that, in my view, should underpin our search for solutions. First, we must recognize that modern institutions that imbibe systematic thinking are the most important prerequisite for success. We cannot use the institutional approaches of the 20th century to solve the problem of the 21st century. Let me illustrate this with an example. India's National Master Plan for Multimodal Connectivity, Pradhan Mantri Gati Shakti, is a unique conceptual and operational framework that brings together all relevant ministries and departments of Government of India and even state governments for a more holistic and integrated planning of project. Because Gati Shakti, as we know, which was introduced about a year ago, is a framework. It is not a scheme or a program to take up certain infrastructure project, but it provides a framework within which we can have more consistent, more optimal development of different types of infrastructure. It is not easy to interconnect ministries of roadways, railways, airways, and waterways, each with a century or more of established institutions and ways of doing business. But without the hard work of building future ready institutions, we will achieve neither efficiency nor resilience long term. In essence, we must focus as much, if not more, on institutional innovation as on technological innovation. I should say that Gati Shakti is a major and unique institutional innovation. It is not merely a coordination mechanism for various departments, agencies. It also is a digital mechanism which has up till now about 1600 layers of data which can be interconnected and which are used not only to check the location optimality of a particular infrastructure project, but also for planning for economic and social development. Second, we have to carefully think about optionality in our infrastructure system. In the midst of multiple transitions, we must be able to pursue an interactive approach and respond to emerging scenarios. If the future is uncertain, then we cannot lock ourselves into only one way of doing so. As we saw during the pandemic, we not only have risk, but we have uncertainty also. There are so many uncertainties which couldn't be anticipated. We need to have optionality or redundancy for unforeseen and unknown situations in the future. And this is very relevant to our infrastructure, which will be built for the future. Third, modernizing our institutions and being nimble-footed would require the type of capacities that the world, both in South and in the North, presently lacks. We need professionals that are deeply steeped in their disciplines, but that are comfortable to work at the intersection of multiple and diverse disciplines. We need engineers who understand social and economic concerns, and we need social scientists who appreciate the promise of technology. In this regard, the CDRI initiative to launch a multidisciplinary academic network for resilient infrastructure can play a pivotal role. We need a multidisciplinary approach. We need to look at the larger societal and economic context in the context of planning our physical infrastructure and even social infrastructure. What are the downside, who gains, who loses, what are the various types of unanticipated impact, all those things we need to look at. Fourth, while we want to facilitate north-south, south-south, north-north exchange, a large part of the infrastructure services will have to be delivered in the south. Therefore, in our search for solutions, we must focus on affordability, scalability, and sustainability for the emerging economies. As we have seen, many of our development efforts, our development models, approaches have not been sustainable. We need to make them not only sustainable, but also affordable and scalable. Small islands of very good infrastructure services will not help because we need to cater to millions and billions of people in the south. And finally, as is being increasingly recognized, it is important to measure outcomes in terms of reliable infrastructure services to people as opposed to only in terms of creation of hard assets. We should look at people. It is not merely physical assets like roads, power systems, and so on. We need to look at what sort of services people will receive, how it will impact lives of poor and other depressed. For example, we can build very high level telecom internet infrastructure, but unless we are able to bridge the digital divide, the maximum potential cannot be achieved. In summary, if we focus on modernizing our institutions, maintain optionality, create multidisciplinary capacities, focus on what works for emerging economies, and put people at the center, we will be able to develop pathways for resilient infrastructure for our future generations. We are living through unprecedented times marked by complex challenges and uncertainty. At the same time, we have unparalleled possibilities. There is a global momentum on resilience issues. Just a week, just last week, the G20 countries met for the first time to discuss disaster reduction issues. For the first time in the history of G20 deliberations, a separate working group was set up during India's presidency for disaster risk reduction issues. It's a milestone in our history of G20. In less than 2 months, the UN will convene the high-level political forum to discuss progress on Sendai framework. This is a moment of great opportunity. Let us seize it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for those comments. I think it's, highlighting the need for modern institutions that are future ready, and giving the examples of Gati Shakti in India, which is where we've got multiple infrastructure ministries coming together, and there's coordination happening at the center to, look at the work that all of the different ministries are doing. The need for new technologies, the importance of looking at having trained engineers and social scientists thinking about the social solutions for tomorrow, the importance of north-south, north-north, south-south dialogues, the need for newer development models, and the focus on reliable infrastructure services, not only assets, so that we are putting people first when we are thinking about infrastructure. So these messages are very, very well meant for today's discussion. So thank you so much for that. We have now a recorded message from Ms. Isabel Coleman, who's the Deputy Administrator for USAID. She would have been on with us live, but given that it's past midnight in the US, we don't expect that. But she has sent a video recording for us, so we'll play that next.
Good morning. It is a privilege to address this coalition of partners once again, and great to see such a sustained commitment across an array of stakeholders. A commitment not just to advancing the conversation on disaster and climate-resilient infrastructure, but also to spurring action and generating innovative solutions to support those on the front lines of the climate crisis. I'd like to thank Dr. Mishra and Special Representative Mizutori and all of our partners across the Indian government for galvanizing the attention that the climate crisis demands, particularly from the industrialized world, which bears a special responsibility in helping countries brace for the worst impacts of a warming climate. As we all know, for some of the world's most vulnerable populations, time is simply running out. Since the year 2000, climate-related disasters have affected almost 4 billion people, with an estimated cost of more than $2.2 trillion. Climate shocks are so frequent and the knock-on effects so enduring that what we're actually witnessing is chronic climate pain, with historic floods, droughts, and temperatures wreaking havoc upon vital infrastructure and essential food sources. Just last month, satellite data from NASA underscored the strong link between rising global average temperatures and more frequent and intense droughts and rainfall. In addition to confirming that continued global warming means more frequent more severe storms and dry spells, NASA scientists noted that infrastructure designed to withstand once-in-a-century weather events will continue to be tested. And while the world's poor are often the first and hardest hit, entire countries and economies can suffer major financial losses from even a single extreme weather event. But there is some good news. According to the U.S. National Institute of Building Sciences, every $1 invested in resilience saves anywhere from $4 to $11 in future disaster costs. That is in part why President Biden has set forth an emergency plan for adaptation and resilience to bring together all the tools of the U.S. government to help more than 500 million people adapt and manage the impacts of climate change, to establish early warning systems that can save lives during disasters, or harness climate data to boost crop yields, to help countries develop specific plans on how they intend to adapt to climate change so they are in charge of their agenda, and importantly, to marshal capital in support of adaptation. That's also the spirit behind the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And already in just 3 short years, CDRI has delivered results. A CDR fellow at the Indian Institute of Technology caught the attention and the funding of an industry partner with his structural innovation for retrofitting hospital buildings to withstand earthquakes and fires. Another CDR fellow designed a user-friendly web application that enables stakeholders to monitor the relative risk of river migration by analyzing thousands of satellite images. At USAID, we have long recognized the importance of investments in innovation, but the stakes today are higher than they have ever been. If every dollar of official development assistance went toward curbing emissions and climate adaptation, we'd still only reach 10% of current climate financing needs. So we're also employing strategies to draw in and elevate the role of the private sector to scale innovative solutions. For example, in response to USAID's call to action for private sector investment in adaptation, global corporations like Google, MasterCard, and Microsoft came forward with significant adaptation commitments. Commitments like expanding access to climate data, new financial and insurance products that can protect the poor, and innovations to make agriculture more productive and green. Our goal is to encourage a broad wave of private investment in adaptation, not just from global corporations, but from small and medium-sized companies based in countries where we work, from startups and young entrepreneurs, foundations, institutional investors, and asset managers. As a clear complement to all of this work, I am pleased to share that, subject to the availability of funds, USAID will be supporting, with up to $5 million, a partnership between Indian and U.S. universities to be housed in CDRI's proposed Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange. This higher ed partnership will train and empower a cadre of future leaders to advance better integration of resilience into infrastructure planning, design, renovation, and construction, like those who are driving real progress through the CDRI Fellowship. I'd urge other country partners to support the exchange so that together we can leverage the talent of a new generation and hopefully inspire the innovations that will supercharge resilience, save lives, and allow us to drive greater progress on all our development objectives. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today and for all of your work to grow this coalition.
So I think that is really she just announced something that's quite ambitious and important, and I'm seeing Professor Ravi Sinha from IIT Bombay sitting here. I see a lot of professors, academics who've been researching in the field of disaster management and DRI for a very long time. I think just announcing what Administrator Coleman just did allows CDRI and the member countries to start to think about training the next generation to be able to address the problems of today and tomorrow. I mean, I think we've seen how I come from practice, and I've had experiences where I've had to sit with a hydrologist and an ecologist, both of them in their 60s, brilliantly trained, who didn't quite understand, the hydrologist did not understand how the wetland was providing a wetland flood storage function in his calculations. So we've got amazingly trained people, but sometimes they're not able to connect to each other or understand. And once we start talking about nature-based solutions and alternative ways of addressing risks, I think the intention of this academic exchange becomes very, very relevant and important. Dr. Mishra, I'll ask you to say a few words since you've just heard Administrator Coleman, and then I'm going to invite the co-chairs to the stage for a photograph because this is a moment for CDRI. Dr. Mishra?
I thank Dr. Coleman for our very, very critical and relevant suggestions and ideas. And as you know, the announcement of our International Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange Program will be one of the steps in that direction. Should we go now to the Infrastructure Exchange Program, or Mr. Proti?
What did you say, sir? I didn't hear you.
No, should we now go over to the announcement of the Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange Program, or just a comment?
Your comment on the announcement, sir. I think it'll be good to hear your thoughts on the academic partnership that we're starting to build.
Initial address, and it also, Ms. Coleman also mentioned, we need capacity building, we need a multidisciplinary approach. It is in this context that I would like to congratulate the coalition for announcement of this very important initiative, the Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange Program, IRAX. It will help prepare the next generation of infrastructure professionals equipped to address current and future risks and level opportunities for building resilient infrastructure. With the upward trend of disaster events and associated infrastructure losses globally, it is becoming clear that solutions of the past are not going to serve us well in the future, that is characterized by uncertainty. There is a need for us to step up our search for solutions that go beyond safety of assets to secure the entire infrastructure system against disruptions of critical services so that impact of disasters on lives and livelihood can be minimized. This is our moment to come together as researchers, academicians, and practitioners to ensure that the future generation of infrastructure professionals are ready to meet the challenges of the coming decades. Do we have all the answers as our own? Perhaps we do not. I call upon academic institutions across the CDRI member countries to come together to share their existing knowledge and jointly take up this critical task of getting the next generation of infrastructure professionals future ready. India has world-renowned universities and research centers such as the Indian Institute of Technologies. Our academicians have deep knowledge of risk assessment, safe construction practices, community-based approaches to risk reduction, and other specialized yet multidisciplinary approaches. Likewise, there is a wealth of knowledge and experience residing in university centers across the world in many countries. On behalf of India, I invite the research and academic community to join this moment and lay the foundations of infrastructure of the future. I look towards IREX with a lot of hope and believe that this should emerge as the key vehicle for promoting and catalyzing systemic resilience of infrastructure. I wish the initiative all success. Thank you.
I'll take this moment to invite the co-chairs to come on stage, and we'll take a photograph since this is a momentum announcement for CDRI. Please, Kamalveena. And Mona, since you've been, please come. You've been spearheading this as well, so come. Veena, come. Come. Nice to meet you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So it's interesting, I was talking to a young planner from Samoa yesterday, and she mentioned that Samoa, the students are actually going to Australia and New Zealand to study because they don't actually have an engineering school in Samoa. So I think the opportunity to do something in academics, learning from each other, building ways of getting information to all parts of the world is really more relevant, important, and the opportunity because of technology, we can actually do that. I would next like to invite Minister Harbers. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Honored guests, coalition partners, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and thank you for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. I thank Dr. Pika Mishra for setting the scene and also the speech from Mrs. Coleman with the excellent announcement. For me, the timing of this conference is perfect. I happen to be visiting India for a few days together with the Dutch Maritime and Water delegation. A complete coincidence, but above all, a wonderful opportunity to meet with you all this morning. Because the urgency to cooperate internationally has only increased following the publication of the latest IPCC report. And climate change is moving even faster than expected. We'll have to adapt at lightning speed to become more resilient. Certainly, as far as our infrastructure is concerned, the thing that protects us and keeps our economies running, and the reason why we're here today. The Netherlands has been a member of this coalition since 2021 because we're keen to share our experience and learn from other countries. Water is something we've had to deal with for centuries already, but heat and drought are relatively new challenges for us. Our familiarity with water issues has led us to co-host the UN Water Conference in New York just 2 weeks ago. It was only the second time in history that the UN organized a water conference, so it was about time after 46 years. And it showed that we need to radically change how water is used, managed, and valued. That's why the global community agreed upon a robust water action agenda. During this UN World Water Conference, I announced our commitment to scale up our Water as Leverage program. It's an innovative, inclusive approach to developing water infrastructure strategies. Our aim is to contribute to water security and water safety for millions of people in cities worldwide. And our friends in CDRI support us in this commitment. And we're currently at the first stage of designing an urban water infrastructure program for CDRI that uses the water as leverage approach. The CDRI members and partners are being consulted on its development, and we aim to present the program next year. We'll make sure it's on the agenda for the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure 2024. In the Netherlands too, we're working hard to make our infrastructure future-proof. I'm proud to say that at the moment it is world-class, but we can't take this for granted any longer. Much of our infrastructure dates from the middle of the 20th century. With an expected life cycle of 50 to 100 years, and with the increased use and weight of vehicles, it's time to replace it and make it more resilient. One of our basic principles in climate adaptation is working together with all stakeholders in infrastructure. Climate adaptation is a shared journey and responsibility. Public and private sectors are united in such efforts. This requires public-private partnerships. Our country has a great deal of experience with PPPs, so we've developed a knowledge module on PPPs for climate-resilient infrastructure. It's a joint product of the Global Center of Adaptation and banks like the World Bank and the Asian and African Development Banks. The module is freely available online, and we're more than happy to share it. Another of our basic principles is the implementation of stress tests. A few years ago, we performed stress tests on all our national infrastructure networks. In this way, we mapped the impact of factors like heat, drought, and water to identify where the biggest problems are or might occur. And more importantly, to translate that information into mid- and long-term planning. This stress test has also been applied in other countries, for example in Bangladesh. To share our knowledge, we recently drew up a checklist for this kind of stress test. How should it be organized? How can the outcomes be translated into actions and planning? And this checklist is available to you all through the Global Center on Adaptation. Dear friends, an immense task lies before us, shaping the next generation of infrastructure. It's paramount to join forces, to work closely together, and that's why this coalition is so important. I look forward very much to hearing your points of view and best practices. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister, for highlighting, I remember going to Delft, and the Netherlands has been thinking about water for 800 years. So there's a water board, and you go into this building and you see literally signs and conversations around water that started 800 years ago because of the low, the geographic location of the Netherlands. And so I'm privileged to be sitting here, hearing you share tools, share examples, share your experiences with all of us, because I think that is really where the coalition becomes important. I think the importance of all of the different member countries that are doing something innovative in their own countries, being able to brought forth through the coalition for, as Dr. Mishra mentioned, the North-North, North-South, South-South collaborations. I think that is really the opportunity. And I'm really excited that we announced at the New York Summit the partnership on water as leverage, where we will be, the coalition will be taking forward its capacity building agenda, building on what water as leverage has already started. So we're really excited about that as well. So thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
I'm going to next invite Ms. Mami Mizutori. I don't think I want to introduce you. I think you, in this room, you're a rock star. Please, the word.
Thank you very much, Amit. Minister, Excellencies, distinguished participants, I'm very delighted to be here today with you. I would like to thank Dr. P.K. Mishra for his remarks and many congratulations for the launch of the Infrastructure Resilience Academic Exchange, which, as you mentioned, Amit, will facilitate and connect academia practitioners, but also practitioners in different areas, which is very important. So I was last in Delhi 4 years ago, and at that time we co-organized with the Government of India a workshop to flesh out the details of what could be an important coalition for resilient infrastructure. And here we are today, that has become a reality. So I would really like to congratulate the Government of India, the Secretariat, and of course all the members of the CDRI for what has been achieved to this date, including the organizing of this important conference. So UNDRR is also a member of CDRI. We are very honored to be there, and we are very honored to be here in this conference because ensuring that resilient infrastructure is not damaged, ensuring that basic services from these infrastructure is not disrupted. This is one of the 7 global targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the global roadmap for resilience. And we all know that without resilient infrastructure, our hard-earned sustainable development gains will not be sustainable. And to that end, I would really like to commend CDRI for choosing these 3 important themes for this conference, and please allow me to share my thoughts on the 3 themes. So the first one is about developing inclusive and risk-informed systems. How can we do that? It is very important to have meaningful engagement with all stakeholders and communities so that the sense of ownership and trust is increased, and that will contribute to resiliency of infrastructure. In other words, you can have a perfect building code, but if this trust and ownership does not exist on the ground amongst the people who build, who maintain, and who use this infrastructure, then it cannot happen. There needs to be a buy-in for this from all stakeholders. And these systems must be informed with risk, but when we talk about risk, it's about a variety of things. We need to, of course, involve the future climate risk, but also emerging risks such as cyber attacks and definitely geophysical risks. So this has to be a multi-hazard approach, bringing in the historical, current, and future risk into the designing of infrastructure. And unless we put all of this together, then we don't have resilient infrastructure. The second theme of this conference is creating resilient infrastructure assets. And here I would also like to add infrastructure systems and services. Now, transport, energy, and water, these sectors are deeply intertwined. However, many times we find them being operating or maintained in silos, even in many developed countries. So this becomes a detriment to the overall resilience of the infrastructure system. Minister, you emphasized the importance of stress testing, and it should become a constant feature in all countries, stress testing of the infrastructure system. And to this end, UNDRR has also contributed that we have developed a mechanism for stress testing, and I hope that with all the emphasis on stress testing, including what the government of Netherlands is doing, that we can make sure that these stress testing methodologies are reached and implemented to all countries for their systems. The third pillar of this conference is about realizing finance and investment for infrastructure resilience. Now, I must say that the lack of financing for disaster risk reduction and prevention is the big gap that we have. We saw in the opening video that by 2040, $92 trillion will be invested in new infrastructure. 80% of that will come from private sector funding, and 2/3 of these infrastructures will be built in the global south. So if we are not embedding resilience into this new infrastructure, we are doing just the opposite that the Sendai Framework is telling us to do. Sendai Framework says that we need to stop creating new risks and reduce existing risks. But if we do not embed resilience in this infrastructure, we are simply creating new risks. And this is a proven thing, that the cost benefit of investing in resilience when it comes to infrastructure works. However, the reality is that still short-termism is winning over long-term resilience. So governments and stakeholders must create standards and regulatory environments that incentivize the mobilization of both public and private investment in resilience, in resilient infrastructure. We have recently seen evidence of this moving forward because the principles of resilient infrastructure, which UNDRR helped to develop in consultation with more than 100 countries, is now being used by some governments to screen their infrastructure investment. I think this is the right step forward. But much more needs to be done, and this is why the CDRI launch of the Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator Fund during COP27 is very important. We are also at UNDRR looking into what can be more innovative ways to finance resilience, resilient infrastructure, including, for example, resilient bonds. So we hope that many more innovative ways to fund resilience and resilient infrastructure will become a reality. And for that, we look forward to working with all of you. And we hope that we can offer solutions, because as you mentioned, Kamal, at the beginning, we know what the challenge is, we know what the problems are, we know where the gaps are. What we need now are solutions, recommendations to build our resilience, and I'm confident that this conference is doing exactly that. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. I think the theme, the focus on finance, I think as you start to understand, look at climate finance, a lot of people are saying there's already a gap in climate finance. And when you start to unpackage that, it's not just gap in climate finance, but most of the climate finance is actually going towards mitigation. Very, very, very little, I think less than 10% is actually going towards adaptation. And when you start to think about DRI, the agenda, actually, a lot of it is adaptation related. So not only do we need to increase the amount of funds going towards climate, we need to increase the part of funds that's going towards climate adaptation. So the more innovative it can be, the more we can include private sector, the more tools and methods and innovation we can bring to this, I think would serve us all well. And thank you also for really again highlighting the need to engage with communities, because they actually have to buy into this approach. We can come and stand on the pulpits and talk about disaster resilient infrastructure, but unless the communities, the financiers, the private sector are actually buying it, we're just talking to ourselves. So thank you for articulating that. We're going to shift a little bit in perspective. I think we're going to go to Indonesia. I would like to invite Dr. Aditya Jati. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amit. Honorable Dr. P.K. Mishra, also Ms. Mami Misuturi, and Mr. Mark Harbour, and also, ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, everybody who's also in the room. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting Indonesia in this special occasion on Coalition on Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. It is a very important issue that now we are talking also as a hot topic in Indonesia, mentioning about resilience infrastructure. As you might know, also Indonesia, an Archipelagic state, we have more risk rather than any other mainland countries in the world, and we have natural hazards that are also devastating in the countries that related to impact of the disaster itself. Climate change as a driving factor also is impacted to the disaster. When we say that climate change as an upstream and the midstream areas, the disaster risk reduction, and also the goal of the downstream is the sustainable development goals. So now we're dealing with the upstream to downstream, how we can really create the sustainable resilience that we have also mentioned by the President of Republic Indonesia during the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. At that time, the President of Indonesia also mentioned the four concepts of sustainable resilience. The first is strengthening the cultural institution for disaster preparedness, anticipate, responsive, and adaptive to disaster. This is all the disaster preparedness education as well the government as social institution also synergized and responsible to disaster must be shared priority. And the second is about investing in science, technology, innovation, including ensuring access to funding technology transfer. This is related to the investment and also the funding that can be accessed for the strategy of disaster insurance, establishing also the pooling fund that we are also heading to the Indonesian better resilience for the future. And the third is about building disaster resilience and climate resilience infrastructure. Means this is we have to pay a serious attention to the protection of vulnerable groups living in the high-risk areas. So the third key message related closely to the CDRI, that the resilience infrastructure is very important. And the fourth, implementing global agreement to the national to local level. With this four concept of key messages from the Indonesia, the President of Indonesia, I would like also to share how really related to infrastructure for resilience. The first, infrastructure resilience is a backbone of the growth of economy. It means also, when mentioned by SSRG, resiliency as a local related to the community. That's why the growth economic issues is very important related to how we can really deal with the economic growth and maintain the infrastructure to be resilient. Second is about infrastructure resilience is an investment for mitigation and also preventing the risk and reducing the risk itself to make ourselves resilient. This is important since Indonesia is a devastating country for impact of disaster. As you might know, for the past 5 years, Indonesia have been a frequency of disaster for more than 17,000 frequency of disaster, 90% related to hydrometeorological impact, but the most casualty impact of the disaster based on the geological means that earthquake and tsunamis. For the five years, more about 6,000 people have passed away. That's why we don't need another wake-up call. We must do a commitment that the third thing that we have to do is the regulation that can be the umbrella of the resilience infrastructure. Policy and plan have been made also in Indonesia. We're committed to have the resiliency infrastructure also inside the medium and long-term plan related also in the 25 years plan related also in the climate adaptation plan that will also be our target goal for 2045 Indonesia as a national resilience for disaster. In spite of that, we would like to also mention that the goal of the sustainable resilience mentioned by our president is our commitment to align all the SDGs target, also the Sendai framework target, and also the climate adaptation target that will be achieved in 2030. So with this occasion, I would like also to share what we have been doing related on the long-term plan in policy and making as one of the leverage to make the resilience infrastructure as a goal for 2045. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jati. I think it's the fact that you're highlighting that you're starting to put this in your long-term plans. I think that is really critical. As we're thinking about investing in the long term, as we're thinking about how we build infrastructure in the long term, as we start to think about how are we retrofitting infrastructure for the long term, I think now is the time to start putting elements of risk into our long-term planning. So thank you so much for highlighting that. Minister, I'm going to turn to you, back to you, with a question. So, we've, of course, I'm going to lose the question, right? Sorry. Netherlands has been thinking about resilient infrastructure for a long time, and we know that. So, in terms of what's new, so what are some of the new strategies for resilient infrastructure planning being considered by Netherlands to address climate and disaster risks?
Yeah. Well, for us, first of all, sustainable infrastructure should be tailor-made. And even in a small country as the Netherlands, we have a variety of landscapes, of different kinds of soil. The water situation is different in various parts of the country. So it should be tailor-made, and that's why we came up with the concept of adaptive delta management. With strategies and measures that can respond flexibly to various challenges. And we're also more than happy to share all this knowledge. For instance, another thing that we did at the UN World Water Conference was to launch the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Zones. And the main reason to do that is that we have a lot of bilateral relationships where we exchange and develop our knowledge, but that is knowledge that could be shared multilaterally as well. And we would like to do that in this International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Zones. The name itself already says what it is. It is meant for countries with deltas, with huge coastal zones, but also for small island states that have the same challenges. And the basis of what we've developed in all our bilateral relationships is always parts of this adaptive delta management, and that is, I think, the toolbox that we all need to respond to this kind of challenges in various parts of the world, various circumstances, and I think by exchanging that knowledge, we can deepen the knowledge as well.
Thank you so much. I think, the word adaptive and delta planning. So it's like adaptive means you're constantly rethinking what are you doing in your deltas. And interestingly enough, I've had the experience of looking at some of the work that the Netherlands has been doing bilaterally with both Bangladesh as well as in Vietnam. Both of these countries have actually borrowed from the Netherlands, the delta planning, and how that delta planning actually at the largest level starts to translate down to individual cities, regions, and starts to influence all of the decisions. So,
and one of the concepts that we had to develop as well was building with nature. I think some decades ago, no one in the Netherlands would ever think of building with nature because the Netherlands is man-made, and we were always keen to have new land reclamation projects, for instance, new dikes, new dams, etc. But after severe floodings early in the 90s, we have adapted we have invented the program Building with Nature, also the Room for the River project, and that's knowledge that we share throughout the world, because even we in the Netherlands have come to the conclusion that not everything should be man-made and could be man-made. And by building with nature, there's a whole new source of climate resilient solutions that come to mind.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I think nature-based solutions, we hear a lot about it. We are, obviously, all of these forums, you're hearing about it. But I think finding the solutions and how those solutions are working and starting to build the evidence that this actually is a solution and not just, we're talking about it, we're starting to show the evidence. I think that's, so from CDRI's point of view, this focus on solutions in the next 2 days is also part of this understanding of there are certain narratives, global narratives out there. Can we start to build the evidence around those narratives? So thank you for mentioning that. Madam Mizutori, so, you talked about Target D, you talked about Sendai framework. You're going to be coming up with the midterm review soon. What would success look like to you when you think about Target D, which is focused on resilient infrastructure in the Sendai framework?
So success would look like, as I mentioned previously, that we can offer collectively as many solutions and recommendations to fill the gap that we have in resilience. And I would point out one very important area where there is still a very big gap, which is risk governance. Now, Sendai Framework has 4 priorities, and strengthening risk governance is one of the priorities, and therefore it is one of the imperatives for resilient infrastructure. So what does a robust risk governance mean? I would mention 3 elements here. One is that there should be a horizontal connection. So within the government, all the sectors, and in this case of resilient infrastructure, are connected, and they are all taking risk-informed policies. In many governments still, risk-informed policy, budget, they are concentrated in one agency which is in charge of disaster risk management, but that will not do the trick. So you need a horizontal connection of risk governance within the government. And then after that, you need a vertical connection. So risk governance needs to be multi-layered. It starts from the global, or maybe we can start from the community, but there's global, regional, national, local, and community. And especially in the context of a country, if the national, local, community level governance of risk, and in this case, again, infrastructure is not connected, then you cannot have good risk governance. And the third is the point that I mentioned. It is about engaging all non-stakeholders, non-governmental stakeholders into the governments. So yes, it is the government's primary responsibility to have a robust governance system, but in that system, you need to reflect the voices of all non-stakeholders, of course the private sector, but also the civil society and all the groups that work at the community level. Now, in order to help government address this risk governance, we have, as I also mentioned, developed in consultation with more than 100 countries, what is called the Principle for Resilient Infrastructure. And of course, any principle needs to be simply understood. It needs to be universal. So there are 6 principles, and the key words to each principle are the following. First, it's continuously learning. Second, it's about proactively protected. Third, it's environmentally integrated. Third, socially engaged. Fifth, shared responsibility. And 6, it is about adaptively transforming. So I'm delighted that already the minister touched upon some of these about the nature, about the adaptivity. And I hope that you can, if you're not familiar with these principles yet, if you go to the prevention web of UNDRR, you can have the full text of these principles. So please do go to that. And now we have developed a handbook that goes together with this principle, and we are working with 4 countries, so Costa Rica, Trinidad and Tobago, and eventually Panama and Ghana, to see how this can actually be implemented, the principles with the handbook in these countries. One more last thing is that we are also working with CDRI to develop a global mechanism, a methodology for revising national frameworks for resilient infrastructure. And again, in 4 countries, Chile, Tonga, Bhutan, and Madagascar, we are rolling out this, and eventually we want to reach a mechanism, a methodology that can be globally adopted by all member states. So there is much to do in this realm of risk governance, but we sincerely know that this is the basis of having a resilient infrastructure system.
Thank you so much for highlighting, why risk governance is so critical. When you come from water space and you realize that we have administrative boundaries. The water doesn't respect administrative boundaries. So when you think about flooding issues or when you think about water security issues, you're often relying on relating to other administrative boundaries. And this is where, larger, the Delta Plan, for example, thinking about integrating horizontally. Dr. Mishra mentioned the Gati Shakti as one such horizontal integration. You start to think about how you have to not only think horizontally, particularly when you start thinking about multiple hazards. Issues of, I'll keep talking about water because we've got the minister here and I love water. And that is one of the biggest challenges coming our way. I mean, if you think about climate risks, a lot of it is hydromet related. And in that context, starting to think about risk governance, starting to think about how is water being managed at a catchment level, how does that translate down to what you're doing in an urban context, in irrigation, all of that is very linked. So I think that importance of risk governance that you just highlighted, that is fundamentally incredibly important. So thank you. Dr. Jati, I'm going to come to you. So as a rapidly growing middle income country, which is undergoing significant infrastructure growth, what are the strategies being adopted at the national, subnational, and local level to mainstream climate and disaster resilience?
Yeah, thank you, Amit. So as I mentioned also before that we have a long-term plan, what we call the National Master Plan on Disaster Management 2020 to 2045. This is a 5-year national plan. For every 5 years, we have what we call the National Disaster Management Plan. This will be adopted also for every subnational level. Every subnational level means province and district. Is a mandatory that they will have a disaster management plan, including also the National Action Plan for Climate Change Adaptation. So this is how we can, put this as a regulation, as an important mandatory for every national and subnational level, especially on how we related to the target of mentioning Sendai framework, SDGs, and so climate adaptation. So everybody is on board, inclusively. Collaboration is very important in this case, that not only the government itself, but collaboration with other entities, including stakeholders, private sector, NGOs, and also even the community is play a very important role to make themselves resilient. We have also programmed what we call the village resilience program. This is in the scale of the village. With the Ministry of Village also, we try to put the program on resilience village, to put the resilience community itself to make their program. And it's a challenge also as an archipelagic state, small islands. We have to put this as a, priority, especially for the small island that are very vulnerable and also high risk related to climate change. The other case that we also, the entry point also is how to integrate all the data itself in one data system on disaster management. as BNPB and DMA is one of the organization to put all integrated data into one. For example, we mentioning that around 479,000 schools now, according to the risk mapping, 75% are in medium and high risk. With this, infrastructure is very important. We also integrate with also other infrastructure related to health, hospital, health facilities in the local level. So how we can really make sure that the infrastructure mentioning in the Senate framework, there's 12 sector there, including schools and also health facilities should be safe. With the government, the local government now, we also try to endorse them to assess, especially for schools or critical infrastructure that should be also related with earthquake-prone area to be assessed. And we have a team, what we call the Committee for Infrastructure under the Ministry of Public Work, to work together with BNPB and to check the facility there. In the moment now, we're working on how we really make this infrastructure really work from national to subnational level, including the local level. Thank you, Amit.
I think I picked up two things here which resonated quite well. One is the Village Resilience Program. And I think as we all are coming out of COVID, we have experienced this notion for being self-reliant. Whether it's around food, where getting food from larger distances was not that easy, whether it's other things that we've relied on our neighbors. So I think just thinking at the smallest unit, which is the village, and thinking about self-sufficiency, thinking about reliance at the village level is something one could probably learn from, because that's where the community is probably most engaged as well. And the second point you mentioned is data. I think I just want to also take a minute here to highlight that in the next couple of months, CDRI will be launching a global platform for resilient infrastructure, which will provide data across multiple hazards and multiple infrastructure. And this becomes really important for countries that may or may not have this kind of data. So I think we'll be launching that in the next couple of months. The importance of data, the importance of evidence is clearly something we need to keep working on. We're coming to the end of the session, but I do want to give a moment to all of the speakers to see if you want to add some final words. If not, we will start to close the session. Anything you want to add? This was not prepared, so I understand.
Well, there's a lot to reflect upon, but I think that we've had all the parts, all the ingredients for disaster resilient infrastructure are present. So it's time to act for governments. And one of the issues that I did not touch upon was what you just mentioned: the availability of data, the development of early warning systems, but also having data in an integrated way, fully accessible for all stakeholders. And I know of various countries that already organized a kind of platform to exchange this data, but it is of paramount importance. There are so many data available in the world, and we still don't make enough use of it.
Thank you. And I think that really is a point that CDRI, it's an ambition that we've articulated, that we will start to bring out not only the data, but also start doing capacity building around how do you use that data? How do you use that to make the right decision? So thank you for highlighting that. Any final words?
It is, again, one of the themes of this conference is about inclusivity. And I think that is very important when we talk about involving all non-governmental stakeholders into the planning of resilient infrastructure. We should never forget what we call the most vulnerable groups, which many people say are not vulnerable per se, but society makes them vulnerable. And there's a long list, but women and girls, persons living with disability, indigenous people, etc., etc. So governments really have a very strong responsibility to have a national platform for all policies around disaster risk reduction and, of course, for resilient infrastructure so that what is designed and built and maintained reflects the needs of these people.
Thank you so much. And I was, as you were saying that, I was just also reminded of what the Prime Minister said in his opening speech, where he mentioned that, when you're building infrastructure, leave no one behind. So I think that really is this thing.
And especially being a member of a government, for governments, I think it's most important to realize what Mrs. Coleman said. $1 invested in prevention saves us $4 to $11 in the disaster costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually last week at the G20 DRR working group, this came up a lot. And I think the question that was coming up was, there's a World Bank study we all end up using, which says $1 is, the return is $4. And the discussion in the room was, well, that's the average. But let's now start to build the evidence that shows if it's $1 versus 4 versus 5 versus 8. So let's start building that evidence, because in government, that's the evidence you need to make a justification for resilient infrastructure. So thank you for highlighting that. Dr. Jati, any final words from you? And Dr. Mishra to close. But Dr.
So I think, yeah, thank you, Amit. So once again, resiliency infrastructure is one of the fundamental thing to achieve the sustainable resilience, and we are committed on that. Of course, resiliency infrastructure is also one of the backbone of the economic growth, and also reduce the risk and also how to mitigate itself. So I think we are committed on that for the future risk. Thank you, Amit.
Dr. Jati. Dr. Mishra, I'll now invite you to close this session.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Poti. I think it has been an excellent session. All the panelists together have brought out a very, very comprehensive roadmap for disaster infrastructure. In fact, from all these, one can get a very comprehensive view of what we need to do and what we should do and what we can do, starting from prevention of by making disaster the resilient infrastructure by investing $1 and getting much higher benefit. Role of finance and very critical role of finance. Then of course the role of private sector, many other aspects, and the national platform which Ms. Mami mentioned. People should be at the center. The role of data, and I should say that data should go beyond how to use the data, because at the cost of repetition, I would like to say that the example of Gati Shakti, it is not merely having data and using it to validate the locational advantage of a particular project, but also it can be used for future planning. The focus will be on scalable solutions for this edition of ICDRI, and it is an opportune time for that. And I hope that the discussion over the next 2 days will help define the pathways for enhanced uptake of innovative policy practices and financing mechanisms to enable infrastructure resilience. ICDRI 2023 is uniquely positioned as a platform focused on climate and disaster resilience of infrastructure. I encourage the participants attending in person as well as virtually to engage and contribute to the purposefully curated discussion on the DRI solution. I am sure all the ideas put forward in this panel discussion also will be relevant to building a new framework and a roadmap. I wish the ICTRI 2023 a resounding success. Thank you.
So, with that, we'll close this session. I invite all of you to be actively participating for the next 2 days. I also have a small gift for both the people on stage. I can't share that with people who are not on stage, but maybe we'll find a way to get them to you. We've actually planted a tree in your name for joining this session. So,
Thank you.
Minister, I think we can come.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amit.
We should- We have one photograph and I think, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Minister.
much.
Thank you very much.
I think now we have lunch.
I
Lunch is served.
would like to thank the government of the Kingdom of Netherlands because of
Where is
The next session in this studio starts in 45 minutes. There is also XP